Welcome back, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about something that I oftentimes misdiagnose in my greenhouse when I start ending up with a situation that you're probably more than familiar with. If you go online, you're like, why are my plants doing this? And you look it up online, there's like 100 different reasons as to why your plants are doing that one specific thing that you're trying to look up. Yeah, that kind of a thing. And so I know better. I know about this, but for some reasons, it's not very common. It doesn't happen very often in my garden, but it does tend to happen because of the way I feed my plants and stuff. And so what I'm talking about is we're going to talk about a deficiency. We're going to talk about calcium deficiency specifically in your plants and in your garden, especially with pepper plants, but it also affects tomato plants and everything else. So we're going to talk a little bit about the deficiencies, what to look for, and in general, how we remediate this problem. So let's take a look at some of the signs of calcium deficiency and how we're going to go about taking care of this. So we'll just take a quick look at some of the plants and some of the problems I'm having. All right, so it's not as bad now because I tried applying several different things to see if my plants were going to improve, and it wasn't making it better, it was actually making it worse. So I tried a number of different things and I didn't see a response at all. If you're going to apply something in general to your plant, you see like, oh, your plants are kind of getting yellow. So you add a little bit more nitrogen. If that doesn't seem like the next day you walk out here and you don't see the top slightly darker green than you did the day before that or whatever, and it just stays that way or maybe even gets a little more yellow, nitrogen isn't your problem. And it could be very, very, very subtle. It could be the smallest thing. If you look at your plants every day and you know what you're looking at, you know what the action is, you know what's going on like that, and then you add something and you see a little bit of a change, you know you're on the right track. That's generally what I go by. But there could be 100 reasons why your plants are generally starting to look very light green like this. It could be anything from diseases, nutrient deficiencies. Oftentimes, when you see light green like this, a lot of times temperature divergences can cause this problem. Like we're getting temperatures that are still going down into the 40s. And then it goes up to 100 during the day. These are plant stresses. These things can also cause yellowing to your plants. It could be, lack of the type of sunlight that it needs. And so there's a lot of things that can cause these problems. And trying to diagnose the problem can be very challenging. Now, oftentimes, like you, I go to Google and I start typing in, why are my plants yellowing? I'm looking for an answer. And I just want a quick answer so I can get on with life. And unfortunately, Google will give you all the answers you're not looking for. And that's pretty much what happens to me. However, having been doing this for many, many, many years, I know all the problems that are associated with what you're looking at right here. And it's sometimes the most obvious problem. And I tend to, like everybody else, not remember that's the reason why the problem is what it is. It's usually the last form of remediation is the one that's the problem. You're trying everything else. You're adding more nitrogen, you're adding more of this, you're doing more of that, you changed the soil, you added more stuff to the soil, you're doing everything you can to remediate the problem. And then finally, towards the very end of like all your tries and your challenges, you finally realize that's what the problem is. And then that's usually the last one. And that's where we're at now. So I finally figured out what was going on with my plants. And I should have been the first thing that I've dealt with in the beginning, and I kind of knew I was going to have a problem in this area to begin with, and I tried to deal with it in the beginning, but there's only a few very unique ways to deal with this particular problem when you see it. Okay, so what we're talking about here is calcium deficiency in general. So what happens is, for example, I'm the guy who likes to add a lot of Epsom salt to my plants because it's one of what we know as secondary macros. So you have your primary macros, which is your NPK, right? And then you have what's known as your secondary macros, which is your magnesium, your sulfur, and your calcium. Now, without these proper elements in there, your plants are either not going to develop correctly or they're going to develop deficiencies. And there's many reasons why you could be lacking these things in your soil or in your watering or your fertilizing regimens. And so we'll get into what one of the slight mistakes that I've made and been making. From time to time, it does happen, and what's causing me to become calcium deficient. And I'll discuss why that is. But I finally figured out what it was that I did, and I probably shouldn't have done it the way I did, but it happens. When you're growing this many plants, you need to get on a ball, and sometimes you're not playing by the rules, and you skip things, and then you pay the price down the road. So what you're looking at here, and what we're going to talk about a little bit, is calcium deficiency. Now, this isn't the end of the world. This is not a disease. It doesn't mean you lost your growing season because you lost a few weeks, maybe a month's worth of growth. These plants should technically be probably about midway right now. All my plants should be somewhere around 18 inches tall. They should be nice and dark green like this. They should be a nice, healthy looking green. Instead, my plants are staying very small. They're kind of light in color, not necessarily yellow, but they were getting more yellow by the day. And they're not growing. They're not stunting, but they're just not growing. And there could be 1,000 reasons why this particular scenario is taking place. However, there's a few indicators I want to point out to you that are going to determine whether it's everything else and or it's going to be a calcium deficiency. And why the calcium deficiency is happening is also going to help you make the determination of how you're going to treat this problem. So whenever you start seeing yellowing plants, if you go online, you start looking up, why are my plants yellowing? Why are my plants light in color? Why are my plants? They're all going to tell you it's nitrogen deficiency. It's going to be this. It's going to be that. You need to add more Epsom salt to your watering regimen. It's going to be, and none of these things seem to be helping. And then believe me, I water my plants, or I basically fertilize my plants, give and take, once every 2 weeks, and I always give them a full dose of Epsom salt, and the purpose for that Epsom salt is to make sure I got the secondary macros. However, I'm depending on the other sources of my fertilizing regimen to be able to provide the calcium for that secondary macro to take care of that balance. Unfortunately, it's not always the case. So there are a few mistakes I've made this year as far as mixing my soil, and it's kind of my fault. So one of the things I want to point out to you, how you're going to determine whether this problem, as you can see this, so you're also seeing it here in my tomatoes, and you can see it on a lot of plants in different areas. And I got plants growing in all different situations. I got potted plants. I have plants growing in beds. I have plants growing outdoors in the garden. I have plants growing in new types of growing medium. I have plants that are growing in my 5-gallon buckets, and I'm taking all of these things into consideration, and I'm looking at some of them that are showing these signs and some of these things that are simply not showing these signs. And I'm finally coming up to a conclusion as to what partially I did, as well as what the problem is and how to remediate it. So one of the things that you need to be looking for, number one, if you're trying to find a calcium deficiency, first thing you want to keep aware of is anytime you start seeing your plants looking light green like this, as opposed to nice and dark green like these, right? See how nice and dark green that is? But then you're starting to see these plants are light green, but right over here it's dark green. All of these plants that are staying light green and they're not growing and they're just kind of staying at that height, it's not that they're stunting, and there might be other things that are helping contribute to that, like the drop in temperatures and maybe overwatering, or you were watering normal, but it's overwatering now because the plant is not in its full stages of being able to grow correctly. So even what you water normally is now going to be considered overwatering because the plant's not absorbing the water because it's not in that growth stage, right? That vegetative growth. So all of these things start becoming an unbalance and a problem because of the fact that you have a calcium deficiency. And so you're going to start to see this yellowing color, and the first thing you would see online when you start looking up the yellowing color or this light green colors, they're going to say, oh, well, you need to add more nitrogen. I'm going to tell you that that's not the way you're going to deal with it. And if you keep adding more nitrogen to it, it's going to end up killing your plant because the nitrogen is just going to offset the balance of your soil so much so that eventually you burn your plant. So nitrogen is not the problem. Nitrogen should be like the last thing you're worried about, because even if you didn't add nitrogen to your soil, your plant should generally be dark green anyway, because even the organic matter that you're planting in, your organic compost and everything, is going to provide some form of nitrogen because it's always breaking down from the microbial activity. So there's always some form of nitrogen there. Plus, plants have the ability to draw nitrogen from the air and then fix it to the soil to even a small degree. It might not be nitrogen fixers, but they do grab their nitrogen from the air. You'd be surprised how resourceful plants are in providing themselves the nitrogen they need to produce the full photosynthesis process. So nitrogen's usually not the problem. One of the other things they might tell you online is You got chlorosis. You got iron chlorosis. You don't have enough iron in your soil, and this is why you're seeing that problem. Again, it's not going to be iron chlorosis. You would be surprised how much iron is actually in your soil in the form of the iron that you need in order for your plants to function correctly. That's most of the time, iron chlorosis is not usually the problem. It does happen, but it's very rare and uncommon. When you're seeing this yellow color, this light green color, and going into, and it's getting lighter and lighter green instead of getting darker and darker, that's usually a sign of calcium deficiency. Now, one of the reasons why my plants become slightly calcium deficient is because I keep using Epsom salt in my plant watering regimen because it usually works and I never really have a problem. However, what I did on realizing of what I've been doing was I was actually offsetting the balance of my soil by adding more magnesium than the calcium, and the magnesium is actually having a toxic effect instead of a positive effect on my plants. So I need to increase the amount of calcium to balance off the secondary macros. That's my fault. I was just simply not adding the calcium. But part of the reason why I'm not adding the calcium is because I was depending on the calcium that I used to fix into my soil to be readily available, and it just wasn't because of the type of calcium I was using to add to the soil. You need to understand that, because if you don't understand it, you're going to keep adding all this other stuff and it's just going to keep making the problem worse and worse for you. So I want you to understand that you need to be able to have a different perspective on this. That's one of the first things I'm going to start to warn you about. When you start seeing this light green color, and this was even lighter green than what you're looking at now. It was almost yellowy. And when you start to see that, that's the first sign that you have your calcium deficiency. Again, I should have known that. It's just, I don't know. Sometimes it doesn't happen very often, but once in a while this calcium deficiency does happen, and I tend to not go that route for some reason. And even when I do realize it's a calcium deficiency, it's very difficult to remediate a calcium deficiency relatively pretty fast. And there's reasons for that, and we'll talk about that. But it's hard I can solve a magnesium deficiency, I can solve a nitrogen deficiency, I can solve a phosphorus deficiency really quickly. Calcium is one of the harder ones to deal with on a very quick basis. A lot of people know about blossom end rot. That's usually when you see blossom end rot. It's not that you're deficient in the calcium so much. You have an imbalance in your soil, and the blossom end rot is a result of that. So adding the calcium to the soil 90% of the time will often remediate your blossom end rot problems. But it's the type of calcium you're going to add to your soil to solve that problem. If you try to buy calcium, calcium can come in 15 different forms: calcium carbonate, calcium manganate, calcium phosphate, calcium. There's all different forms of calcium, potassium, calcium. There's all these forms of calcium. You need to get the right form of calcium in its right form to work. And I use calcium carbonate. Even though it's calcium carbonate, it also has different forms. There's a fast-acting version of it, and then there's a slower-acting version of it, simply based off of particle size and everything else. It gets complicated, guys. So there's very few things that you can work to remediate a calcium deficiency. But for some reason, what I'm going to show you today works very well. And it works very quick and very fast acting. And we'll talk about that. But I want to finish how you're going to tell that you have a calcium deficiency with your plants. I know this is a long video. It's long-winded, but you need to have a full comprehensive understanding of this so it embeds into your mind, and when you see it again, you know how to deal with it. Again, it doesn't happen very often with me. I tend to lean towards everything else, and it's not what the problem is. The other sign of a calcium deficiency that's going to be a major caller for you, this is going to be the one that's going to really, really, really start to really, it's going to resonate with you. And don't ever forget this. I tend to forget this. I tend to lean towards other problems why I see this. But what we're going to show you here is it's going to be the main diagnosis identifier for you to know that you have a calcium deficiency. So let's go and show you what that is. One of the main things you're going to see is this right here. Oftentimes I misdiagnose this as being edema. Here's another example of crumpling and stunting. You can see here, you can see the leaves are misforming, they're crumpling and stunting. This is not edema. I'm just showing you examples of what is going to diagnose calcium deficiency. And over here you see more crumpling, malformed leaves, more of that. See, so not every plant is going to exhibit this very problem. You can see, like here, the leaf kind of wants to crumple up. It's shrinking at the veins. It's not forming correctly. Here's a good example of calcium deficiency. These were starting to turn more yellow, but once I started adding the calcium to it, the leaves are starting to flatten out. Here's more signs of like calcium deficiency. You can see how the veins are staying tight, but all the stuff in the middle is like popping out because the veins aren't growing. Now, the veins should be growing with the leaf size evenly, but when you have a calcium deficiency, the veins of the leaf will tend to stay restricted, small, and all the stuff in between the veins will just pop like it's trying to get out of its own, out of its way, and it can't because the veins aren't growing evenly with the rest of the plant. This is a result of calcium deficiency, and you can see earlier stages of the plant it was fine. It's not until these later stages the calcium deficiency really started exhibiting itself. So yeah, this is an edema. You don't see the spots on the bottom, but this is definitely a calcium deficiency. I got random examples all over the place. You could see even here it's not very heavy, but the leaves are kind of cupping upwards. It's not a disease. They're kind of cupping upwards. They're not opening and fanning out very good. And so you can see a lot of these signs. They're kind of cupping upwards. They're light green in color. They're wrinkly. They're kind of like the leaves are getting smaller. This is all a sign of calcium deficiency, guys. So that's your main indicator. When you see that, the first thing you need to do is you need to start applying a remediation form of calcium very quickly to your soil. There's no balance, and you need to get that back into balance very quickly. You got everything else, but you don't have that. The other thing, too, you do want to make sure you have your magnesium. Another sign of a major sign that you want to really keep your eyes on, and this can mimic itself in many different ways. And one of the major signs that you don't really see too much with pepper plants, but you'll really see a lot more with tomato plants. It's very common for tomatoes to do this. And that major sign for a calcium deficiency with tomato plants, it's not only the slightly yellowing color like you see here, but it's also the light coloring of your flowers. You see they almost look white in nature, right? They're very light in color. That's another sign of this calcium deficiency. But one of the most important things that you're going to notice with tomato plants when it's really suffering from a calcium deficiency and just not having enough calcium in the soil is when you start to see the yellowing start from the lower part of the plant and it rises up. Oftentimes people tell you that's a virus. That's not a virus. Believe me when I tell you, I know what a virus looks like in tomato plants. It's not a virus. Oftentimes you'll see that the plant will start yellowing at the lower leaves. These leaves should never fall off. You know, your lower leaves should literally stay on there all the way up until the light cycle changes so much so that it's really like September or August, September or October. Then all of that starts happening just because of the temperature changes and the reduction of light. But we're still in the beginning part of the year. We just turned, I think the summer equinox just happened a couple of days ago, so we shouldn't be seeing this at all. However, you're still seeing yellowing on the lower leaves, and they're slowly dropping off. And they're falling, and sometimes you'll even see these leaves start to literally rot. It looks very similar to late blight, but it's not late blight. They're just kind of wilting away, rotting up, and then the whole leaf just falls off. This is a major calcium deficiency. This is something you really need to address, and you need to do this relatively pretty quickly because tomatoes have a very fast life cycle. They're not something you want to play games with. So if you're starting to see your lower leaves fall off on your plants and it's traveling up the plant, it's not necessarily a disease. Most of the time, it is simply calcium deficiency. Like you might see, like that looks like it might be blight. That's not blight. That's actually what we're talking about. The leaves kind of like look like they're like water damage, and part of that is water damage, like overwatering. That's another video I'll save for another day, like there's signs of overwatering your plants and what causes the overwatering of your plants. So in tomato plants, the calcium deficiency is going to manifest itself as you can see, that's less calcium deficient, and here it's really calcium deficient. More sunlight will actually contribute to the calcium deficiency effect because the plant is trying to respirate and transpirate and it's trying to do the photosynthesis. It just doesn't have the secondary macro balance, and so as a result they kind of want to stunt, and then they just start yellowing off. As soon as you start adding calcium to the soil, all of this just suddenly starts disappearing. They start turning green and they start growing again. So again, with tomatoes, it's the lighter colors, the yellowing effect, the dropping of the lower leaves that start traveling up the plant. These are all signs of calcium deficiency. If you get this under control and you do it relatively early in the season, these plants will fully recover from any of that. So that's how you're going to tell with your tomato plants. Your tomato plants are generally going to be light in color, losing lower leaves. They're going to look like they're burning away. The leaves are going to be falling off. All of those signs. First thing I would recommend you do is you start adding calcium to it. Make sure that you have your full secondary macro balance. If you're not adding magnesium sulfate, you need to add that in contrast with it. So maybe your whole secondary macros are deficient, but you need to make sure that you add calcium. Never really add just one or the other, like I tend to do with Epsom salt. If you're adding just Epsom salt and you're expecting these things to turn darker green by themselves, it's not necessarily going to help you. And the main reason for that is that the Epsom salt is just magnesium and sulfur. You need that calcium to complete the secondary macro complex, right? Without that calcium, all the other stuff becomes toxic. So what causes this imbalance? Why should I be seeing that? I make the soil, I add everything you can possibly imagine to my soil to give it the calcium it needs, but yeah, I still have this imbalance. Does that mean I destroyed my growing season? No, it doesn't, and it doesn't mean you did either. However, you need to understand that your calcium deficiency can destroy your season if you don't do something now. As soon as you see it, you need to do something. So you're now asking a question. You just took up all this time to tell me it was a calcium deficiency. I now know how to diagnose my calcium deficiency. How do I deal with it? Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to show you how we deal with a calcium deficiency. And this is it right here. Tums is one of the greatest forms of calcium you can use to remediate this problem. Now you can buy it. Tums is basically, if you look at the active ingredient, let me try to get you on there. You look at the active ingredient right there. It's basically calcium carbonate. However, calcium carbonate can come in several different forms. It can come in fast-acting calcium carbonate. It could come in slow forms of calcium carbonate. It could come in many different forms. We want a type of calcium carbonate that's going to be fast-acting and to really get us back on track relatively pretty quick. And you can buy calcium carbonate from Amazon, for example, by the 1 pound bag. You just don't know if that calcium carbonate that you just spent $20 on is going to be the right form of the calcium carbonate that you need to be fast acting and solve your problem. You don't know that, and you don't know that until you buy like 5 or 6 different forms of calcium carbonate to know if you got the fast acting version of it. That's just a simple layman's way of putting it. I'm not going to get into all the science of it. When we talk about fast-acting calcium carbonate, we want to use Tums, because Tums are generally going to be that fast-acting version of pure calcium carbonate. That's all that's in here. You can basically go to the store, make sure you read the ingredients thing so there's no other things in it. It's just pure calcium carbonate, and then you take that pill and you want to take that and you want to put it into a thing and you want to crush that up into a powder. It's very easy to do. Then add that to your water, and then start watering it into your plants, and do that on a semi-daily basis. Just don't overwater your plants. Be very careful. Watch the way your plants are. Keep your plants watering the same, but every time you water it, keep adding that calcium carbonate to it on a constant basis, daily if you could. And as you do that, you'll notice that your pots won't stay wet. Like you see how they're staying moist, they'll start drying out right away. They'll start to, like this plant here is really snapping back real nice. It's really coming back good. And you'll notice that your plant pot will it'll start drying right out. It won't stay wet like this. You see how it's staying wet? That's because it's not soaking, it's not bringing water up the stem anymore for transpiration and respiration through the process of photosynthesis. It's not doing that. So now it's sitting in soggy, wet soil. You want to see your plants literally dry out those pots on a constant and regular basis. And that is telling you that your plant is now using the water, and it needs to be watered heavily and on a regular basis. And the reason for that is the plant has everything it needs to transpirate and respirate, because you have balance in your soil with the calcium, magnesium in your secondary macros, right, and your sulfur. Usually sulfur is not really a problem with deficiencies, but it can be as well. Believe it or not, sulfur deficiencies can mimic very much the same thing here, but it's very quickly and easily corrected with Epsom salt. So yeah, you'll start noticing your plants really making a very major change when you start seeing your pots literally dry out like that very quickly. By midday, your pots will be really dry instead of staying wet and moist. That's a very good sign that your plant's really starting to go into a great process of photosynthesis. You want to see that's a good sign of remediation. When your plants don't dry out like that, that means your plants aren't taking up the water. Why are they not taking up the water? Because they're suffering from a deficiency in your soil. So that's a good sign. I wanted to point that out to you. So if you're looking to see what the changes are, one of the other major changes is like you might have yellowing on some of your plants. You can see here some of the darkening of the stems, kind of darkening on the leaves. Some people will be like, oh, that's a disease. No, it's not a disease. It's just too much magnesium and not enough calcium. You're also seeing some of the yellowing in here. And this yellowing will virtually reverse before the leaf dies, but it'll virtually reverse. You can see it's starting to come back on one side. And on this side, it's still slightly yellow. Within about a week, this will be completely green and back to normal. Maybe not totally normal, but it'll be back to green. The plant will continue to grow. No more of this leaf curling and, cupping of the leaves. Oftentimes, cupping of the leaves. People misunderstand with tomatoes. They see leaf curl and they panic right away. There's many reasons for leaf curl. It's not a virus or a disease every single time. Oftentimes, cupping downwards is usually a sign of deficiency or improper photosynthesis. Oftentimes, cupping the other way or curling is either due to heat stress or it's due to calcium deficiency. So anytime you start to see cupping on your plants, if it's not a dwarf variety, for example, you can see these are like dwarf, and this is known as raguse leaf. They want to cup and do something very similar to this, but that's raguse, that's expected. This is not raguse, this is a regular plant, and it shouldn't be cupping, but it's cupping, and that's because of calcium deficiency. Your plant leaves should really, ultimately, if you want to see a really healthy looking plant, your plant leaves should really look like this. This is a very healthy plant. This is ultimately what you want to see. Now, you may not get that right after you do all your remediation. It may never come back to that with all your older foliage. However, all the new foliage coming off thereon will start to look like this as you bring balance to your soil. So once you remediate your plant, don't expect every old leaf to turn back to normal. They may still need to shed all those old leaves because all those old leaves consist of a chemical structure of what you've been adding to that soil. Once that soil changes because you add balance, all those old leaves are garbage. It needs to create new leaves with the new soil balance of nutrients in it. I know it sounds crazy, but that's how it works. And so, yeah, that's basically with tomatoes. That's how you're going to be able to tell that you have a problem with calcium deficiency. 90% of the time, your problem with tomatoes and peppers, when you're seeing that color or that problem, is because it has a calcium deficiency. A couple exceptions to the rule when it comes to that. Number one, when you start seeing edema, this is a wild version of wild hairy tomatoes. It's actually a third version of wild hairy tomato. However, this plant is an outdoor plant. It doesn't grow very well under anything that's above it. It needs to be in direct sunlight or else it starts to exhibit what's known as edema. Edema is where you're going to start to see this poppling effect. Oftentimes on the bottom, you'll see crinkling and crumpling. And it can exhibit itself in many different ways. Some plants are highly susceptible to it and highly not. Just because I see that, that does not mean it's a calcium deficiency. It's just a simple condition due to certain reasons. And every plant has their own reason. I happen to know with this particular variety that the reason for it happening here is because it doesn't like to grow under anything above it. It needs to be in absolute direct sunlight. If you put it under one of these panels, it's not going to grow right and you will end up with edema, regardless of airflow. Another exception to the rule is now, for example, these plants here are really light green. As you see, they look very lime in color. This is actually the color of the plant itself. This doesn't mean that it's calcium deficient. And this is a new variety of tomato that they grow lighter green. They refer to this new effect, this new style of tomato as Chartreuse. and it just means a light green type of color, as opposed to like all your other green. You get over to that one, it's really freaky looking. It looks lime green. That's just the nature of the plant. That's just a variety of plant that grows that way. That's one of them. Here's another one. This is called Groovy Tunes. This is a Chartreuse variety as well, but with raguse leaves. I do believe that this is possibly a because of the fact that it has raguse leaves, I do believe that this is a dwarf variety of plant. So yeah, you're going to see that. Those are the exceptions to the rule. Don't go panicking because you bought the wrong variety. Make sure that it's not a Chartreuse variety, and give it calcium anyway. It's not going to hurt it. Just don't overdo your calcium, as opposed to like overdoing magnesium, because it's very easy to offset that balance even with calcium. I know it was a long video, but I really need to get into this type of detail to really get you back on track when you're seeing this problem take place in your garden. Oftentimes, even with myself, I tend to misdiagnose things. There's so many other problems that can cause what you're seeing that I just described, that you just tend to go to everything else, and usually you find out in the end the last thing it's like that's what it was, calcium deficiency the entire time. So again, if you see some of these things going in here, first thing I recommend you doing, if you add a couple of tablets of Tums, and you remember, you take the tablets, you got to crush those tablets up, and after you crush them up and you got a powder, then add it to your water, and then water that in there. Generally, 1 tablet's good per gallon. You can add 2 tablets per gallon. It's not going to generally hurt it. You'll see right away that if you add those tablets and you see right away that those leaves immediately start getting dark green, that's your problem right out the gate. And then you'll see a bump in growth too. Like they looks like they came up another inch. Like you'll notice right away the behavior of your plant will change right away. That's your calcium deficiency. If it's anything else like magnesium deficiency or something else, maybe an NPK deficiency somewhere, usually those aren't the problem. You just add a little bit of this or a little bit of that, and your NPK just literally self-corrects almost instantly. So yeah, just keep that in mind. With calcium, you'll see an instant effect with it, and if you see that, you're on the right track. So anyway, guys, again, I hope I answered any of your questions. Do you have any input you want to put in about what I just talked about as far as calcium deficiency and the type of calcium that you like to use to remediate this problem? Let me know. What I like to use is the Tums, as you see there. Tums is a fast-acting form of calcium carbonate that has a really dramatic effect very quickly, very fast, and it'll get you back in your track. If you have something else, let me know. Share your input. I'd love to hear it, and if it's a good suggestion, I'll probably buy the product and review it, and then we'll see if it makes a difference. All right. So anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.